to deliver carbon literacy and decarbonisation trainings to help SMEs to reduce their environmental impact. As Michelle said, she's going to be recording. Just to start off with, who are Eunomia? Why are we here? So we are Eunomia. We're an independent research and consultancy. We specialise in environmental topics from waste and recycling, biodiversity, circular economy, and of course carbon, for both public and private sector organisations, specifically helping businesses to quantify their impact and progress towards decarbonising their operations. Specifically, who are we? My name is Kat. I'm a senior consultant at Eunomia. I specialise in carbon literacy training like this and in helping organisations set decarbonisation strategies. And I've been working in this space for nearly 5 years, joined by my wonderful colleague Kate, who specialises in carbon accounting. All right then, so just as a kind of overview of what we're running for Havering, and we're running a series of workshops and complementary workshops. The first is this online session, which is looking at the causes and impacts of climate change, learning about key terms like greenhouse gases, global warming, etc. The second set of workshops we're doing are in person rather online. They're at the CEME campus in Rainham. And that session covers how businesses can understand their own individual carbon footprint and set steps to decarbonise. And at the end of that session, attendees will be provided with a decarbonisation action library from which you can filter actions that are most applicable to your business, and also a template to develop your own carbon literacy, carbon reduction plan. So looking forward to seeing you there in a few weeks' time. In terms of what we're covering today, so we're going to start with some core climate science, a little bit of time for QA, and then in the second half, we're going to look at climate drivers and impacts, again with time for QA. It's going to be a fairly informal session. Please mute yourself when we're not speaking, but also if you want to contribute at any point or ask any questions, please do raise your hand. As I mentioned, there are some interactive elements, and it would be great if you could chip in if you fancy. And also, if you prefer, you can put a question in the chat if that's easier for you. So moving on to our core concepts. In this section of the training, we're going to cover what do we mean when we say that the climate is changing, and a brief overview of the carbon cycle, the greenhouse effect, and greenhouse gases. Don't worry, it's not going to be like hard science, getting really into the details. This is just kind of setting the groundwork to help you understand how to decarbonise later on. So one of the first things we want to distinguish was weather versus climate. So weather is very much the short-term changes in the atmosphere on the minutes to months, that's temperature, precipitation, etc. Whereas climate is on a much broader scale, so describing what average weather is like over longer periods of time. And the importance of this distinction is that though weather, of course, continues to change on small scales, the climate over the longer time scales has been changing, and this change can be somewhat obscured by normal appearance of changing weather patterns. So when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about the longer term trends in what the average weather is like in different parts of the world. One of the key concepts when it comes to thinking about carbon is the carbon cycle. Carbon is one of the most abundant elements on Earth. It exists in many forms. It's stored in reservoirs across the globe. You've got the atmosphere, you've got oceans, living items, known as the biosphere, and also rocks and soils, so known as the lithosphere. And the carbon cycle is the movement of carbon between all of these reservoirs. Most carbon in the atmosphere is stored as carbon dioxide, which I'm sure is a term we're all very familiar with. And it's important to note that many, these processes are constantly exchanging carbon throughout these different areas of the cycle. It's primarily a closed system, so we're not losing carbon and we're not adding in any carbon. That means that if one reservoir is losing carbon, other reservoirs will increase it. And that's important for understanding how the climate is changing. There are multiple carbon cycle processes. For instance, we've got photosynthesis, plants absorbing carbon dioxide and turning it into sugars. That's removing carbon from the atmosphere or from the ocean, if you're thinking about algae, and then into the biosphere. Animals that eat those plants take in that carbon. And then once those beings die, that becomes fossil carbon deposits. Another key aspect of the carbon cycle is respiration. Vast majority of living things, including us, of course, release carbon dioxide when we breathe, and this moves carbon from the biosphere to the atmosphere. And naturally, these reservoirs are balanced. They maintain a steady exchange of carbon with little change between them. But human activity has been changing some of these processes. For instance, combustion, which moves carbon from the biosphere into the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels. And that's drastically increased carbon emissions. And that is something that we're going to talk about in a bit more detail. later on. One of the other key concepts to kind of accompany, if you like, the carbon cycle is the greenhouse effect. This is a naturally occurring process in which heat is trapped close to the Earth's surface by greenhouse gases. So energy from the sun makes its way to Earth, it's radiated back into the atmosphere as heat, and greenhouse gases absorb much of it as it goes back to space. Without the greenhouse effect, Earth temperature will be below freezing. It is a natural process, as I said, but it's been getting stronger as we've been adding more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, which is therefore causing the heating of the planet. And that's the kind of linking part between the emitting of carbon and other greenhouse gases, which we'll talk about in a moment, and the warming of temperatures. So the emission of CO2 increases the proportion of the sun's radiation that's absorbed and trapped in the Earth's atmosphere. Leading us on to the greenhouse gases. So carbon dioxide is kind of the classic one. We hear about it a lot, but there are actually 4 greenhouse gases. Well, there's more, but these are the major ones. And for each one, it would be great if you could tell me a few activities that emit that greenhouse gas. So carbon dioxide, a very large greenhouse gas. What is an example of an activity that emits carbon dioxide?
Burning coal.
Burning coal, yes, classic. Connor?
Breathing.
Breathing, yep, much more a natural one, absolutely. How about methane?
Landfill gives off methane.
Correct, it does.
Agriculture.
Yep, exactly, spot on. Getting into the slightly trickier ones. Nitrous oxide, any ideas?
Car exhaust.
Yes.
Breathing again.
I'm not sure, actually. Maybe very small amounts. And then finally, F gases. We've got various different HFCs gases. Any idea what emits these? Not a problem. So yeah, as you said, carbon dioxide, you've got respiration, you've got decomposition, you've got cement production, deforestation, and as you said, Peter, burning of fossil fuels. Methane, the classic one is agriculture, specifically cows, and you've also got it from the decay of organic waste in landfills and also emitted during the production of coal. Nitrous oxide, car exhaust, as you say, also emitted during agricultural and industrial activities, and yeah, during the treatment of wastewater. And then F gases are the sort of gas that are emitted from industrial applications, commercial applications. So for instance, like you've got refrigerants, etc. And that's where F gases sit. So the importance of these, we talk about carbon dioxide most of the time when we're talking about global warming, and carbon dioxide, we talk about it in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent. So you'll often see a carbon footprint expressed in CO2e, which means carbon dioxide equivalent. And that basically means that instead of reporting on the different greenhouse gases and how many of those are being emitted from different activities, you kind of standardize them into equivalent units of carbon dioxide. And you do this using their global warming potential. So carbon dioxide is one of the most prevalent gases in the atmosphere, but it's not got the highest global warming potential. So one molecule of methane is 25% more potent in terms of causing the greenhouse gas effect than carbon dioxide. Nitrous oxide is 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide, and F gases, there's a whole variety of F gases, so their kind of relative potency varies. So yeah, this global warming potential was developed to allow comparisons of the global warming impact of these different gases. So it's a measure of how much energy the emissions of 1 ton of that gas will absorb over a given period of time relative to the emissions of 1 ton of carbon dioxide. So larger global warming potential, the more that gas warms the Earth compared to CO2 over that time period. So when you then see CO2e, it's meaning the equivalent amount of carbon dioxide for all of these different greenhouse gases. Thinking about one of the key points when we're thinking about climate change is the climate science behind them. Climate science refers to the study of the atmosphere over time and how human activities are changing that. The vast majority of actively publishing climate scientists agree that humans are causing global warming and climate change. Most of the leading scientific organizations around the world have issued public statements expressing this. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, is the most kind of well-regarded body when it comes to this. It's the United Nations body for assessing the science related to climate change. I think a couple of years ago you might have seen news articles relating to the publication of this. They assess all of the available academic research on climate change and climate science and synthesize it, and they do it every 5 or so years, and they produce special reports. In 2023, this synthesis report was released, so you might have seen news articles relating to it, and they had key messages relating basically to the certainty amongst scientists that human-induced global warming is causing unprecedented change to the climate. So that's kind of at a global level, thinking more down at the UK scope. So in 2022, the total UK greenhouse gas emissions were 406 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, as we talked about carbon dioxide equivalent kind of representing all greenhouse gases. As you can see, domestic transport is the most significant one. This includes emissions from road vehicles, domestic aviation, shipping, fishing vessels and railways. It doesn't include international shipping. Interestingly, that's international aviation, sorry, that's reported differently. Buildings and product uses is the second most significant source of emissions. Those are mostly from emissions from fuels combusted in buildings, mostly for heating. Emissions from fuel combustion in manufacturing and construction is the next largest contributor, 14% from industrial processes. And then equivalent amount of carbon dioxide equivalent is produced from emissions from power stations, from the generation of our electricity. Your fuel supply, that's the 8%. That's emissions associated with extracting and producing and processing the oil and gas that we then burn in all of these other different sectors. So the actual creation of those fuels is a very energy intensive process and produces a lot of emissions. Agriculture, you can see there 12%. That includes agricultural machinery, fuel combustion in tractors, for instance, and of course livestock. And then waste is again about 5%, and that is emissions from the treatment and the disposal of waste, for instance, landfill. And as you mentioned, Peter, the methane emissions from landfill. Then this tiny little one down here, LULUCF, stands for land use change and forestry, and that's a very small proportion of the UK's emissions. That basically means kind of emissions and removals of carbon dioxide from changes in the carbon stock in forests and grasslands and wetlands, etc. So that is an overview of what the UK's emissions footprint looks like. It has actually been gradually decreasing over the last couple of years, but part of that was due to COVID causing a big drop in domestic transport, and it's still kind of fluctuating a lot. Going one step more in our narrowing down, if you like, of our understanding. So looking specifically at Havering. So Havering's emissions in 2022 were 914 kilotons of carbon dioxide equivalent. As you can see, there are similarities or parallels with the UK footprint, but there's also some trends that are specific to Havering and the kind of makeup of businesses and activities that happen within London by the borough of Havering. Transport is by far the largest contributor. Nearly 50% of Havering's territorial emissions come from transport. The second largest is domestic, and that basically means emissions from energy consumption in and around the home, and that is very much in terms of heating and electricity use within those buildings, followed by the same emissions, but specifically looking at businesses and industries within Havering. You can then see that agriculture, waste and the public sector are responsible for quite small, about 10% in total. But transport and domestic housing emissions are the largest contributors to emissions in Havering. So that is a kind of whistle-stop tour of some core carbon science terms and what the kind of emission state of play is at the moment. Do we have any questions? And hello, Karen, thank you for joining. Any burning questions about the carbon cycle? No? Okay, Karen, hello. Thanks so much for joining. We're running through this session, which is on carbon literacy. We've done the first section, which was looking at climate science, and we're now looking to drivers of climate change and impacts in the second section. Please do feel free to put your hands up at any point if you've got any questions. Okay, so moving on to the second section of this workshop, which is looking at the drivers of climate change and some of the impacts of climate change. We've covered what climate is, what's the greenhouse effect, and how there are different sources of emissions from human activities. Now we're going to kind of look at how that is actually producing or leading to climate change. So by the end of this section, you'll be able to cover how have greenhouse gas emissions changed over time, and what are the current impacts of climate change, and also what are the future impacts of climate change projected to be. So this might be a graph that you're familiar with. It's quite a well-known, well-publicized graph in climate circles, and it's called the hockey stick graph because of its shape of kind of going up and then suddenly curving at the end. So this graph shows the parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. So it's the number of units of mass per million units of total mass. So if carbon dioxide is at 427 parts per million, which it was in June 2024, that means that in 1 million particles of air, there are 427 particles of carbon dioxide. So ppm represents the concentration of that gas in the atmosphere. So you'll see here that you've kind of got these cycles of carbon parts per million changing from about 180 up to maybe 280 or so, roughly over 100,000 years or so. And these are naturally occurring cycles. These happen for various reasons, but one of them is like the changing shape of the Earth's orbit, which tweaks very slightly and kind of becomes more oval and less oval over time. But then about 100 years ago, you see this massive hockey stick curve, this massive increase in parts per million to over 400. And you'll have seen that there's never been higher than 300 up until now. So 427, which is what is in June, that is a record high. This has had severe impacts on our climate, and it's very much off track with the trajectory needed to meet our goals in terms of decarbonising, which we'll get onto in a little bit more in a moment. And the scientists, as we talked about in that IPCC slide, scientists are 99.9% certain that this is being caused by human activities. So going to go through a few graphs that kind of show this in different ways and through different perspectives. And we won't dive into all of the data, but I think it's interesting to see how this has changed through time, also in different regions. So this graph shows the annual emissions per global region. Emitters such as Europe and the US are responsible for the majority of emissions to date, but you'll see that in recent decades, they have reduced their emissions slightly, whilst the Asia region and countries such as China and India have actually kind of accelerated over the last 10, 20 years or so. This graph here shows something quite similar, how the emissions are split between different regions, but also shows cumulative contribution over time between regions. So you can see that Europe and the US, despite reducing their emissions slightly over the past 10 to 20 years, have over time been the most significant emitters of carbon dioxide, with other countries emitting significantly less from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which is often taken as the kind of benchmark of what carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were like before industrial activity or human activity massively accelerated through the Industrial Revolution. As we were talking about earlier, the kind of crucial link is that between carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and global temperature. And I think this graph shows that quite well. So the greenhouse effect, the naturally occurring process that we learned about earlier, by which the sun's radiation is absorbed by the Earth, that is reinforced and strengthened as the parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere increases. So as we've seen in this graph, as parts per million have massively increased, that has correspondingly led to an increase in temperature because more radiation is trapped, and this causes global temperatures to rise. So you can see that temperatures have been rising since the Industrial Revolution. It's been a bit of a lag. Emissions started like growing here, a bit of a lag as that's changed, as that has caused temperature change. So human activities, particularly emissions of heat-trapping greenhouse gases, are mostly responsible for making the planet warmer. So overall, the average global temperature on Earth has increased by at least 1.1 degrees Celsius since 1880. And the majority of that has occurred since 1975. So that's a rate of nearly about 0.2 degrees per decade. And this graph shows the global temperature anomaly compared to the average between 1951 and 1980. So during that period, the global mean surface air temperature for that period was about 14 degrees, and now it's between 15 and 16 degrees. It's also important to note when looking at these that global warming doesn't mean that temperatures are rising everywhere at every time by the same rate. Temperatures might rise 5 degrees in one region, but then drop 2 degrees in another. But overall, there has been an increase. It's also interesting because 1.1 degrees doesn't sound like a huge amount, but then you think about it, that 1.1 degrees has occurred across, think of the vast amount of radiation that's required to literally heat the entirety of the world's landmass and oceans by that amount. And you start to get a scale of quite how much of an increase that is. So we've kind of thought about, okay, that's what's driving climate change. That's what's leading to an increase in temperature, this increasing amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This diagram here is talking a bit about what does that mean? Why should we care? Why is that important? The middle, that darker blue circle, that shows the driver of climate change, that is greenhouse gas emissions. You've also got other causes such as aerosol emissions and land use change, but fundamentally that's all driving a temperature increase through the emission of greenhouse gases. In like that middle lighter blue donut, you can see what that leads to. So those are the changes to the climate system. And that is, the climate system encompasses, you've got ocean currents, you've got warming oceans and rising sea levels. So that's the impacts on the ocean. You've also got impacts in terms of ocean acidification, melting ice sheets, then also more extreme weather events and warmer land and also warmer air. So this is changing all different parts of the climate system. Then that final light blue outer donut shows what that means in terms of impact. And the impacts are wide ranging and covering kind of all aspects of the natural world, and then of course leading to the impacts on humanity. So you've got damage to infrastructure, food insecurity, as crops that we've traditionally grown aren't necessarily able to grow in the same places or to the same prevalence. You've got conflict, climate migrants as places become inhospitable. Localized flooding, particularly of coastal regions, linked to that food insecurity. You might have fishing shoals and stocks of fish unable to stay in the same places in the same way, heat stress, loss of biodiversity, and various other impacts. It's also important to note that climate change is non-linear. So the climate has tipping points and tipping elements. A tipping point is defined as a critical threshold beyond which a system reorganizes, often abruptly and or irreversibly. And there are concerns that the tipping point is a component of the Earth system that once there has been a certain level of climate change or temperature rising, and that will lead the global or regional climate to change from one stable state to another stable state, but that second stable state might be much less suitable for sustaining human and natural systems. So this little diagram here shows the Earth's tipping point. And that may result from changes that occur non-linearly or faster than the rate expected. So we'll have a linear expected increase of global temperatures. That doesn't necessarily mean to a linear or lead to a linear change in the impact. I think it's also important to note, sometimes we think of climate change as something that happens in the future, but very much climate-related disasters are already occurring, and we see that in the news every day. We've got heat waves in some areas of the world that can cause wildfires, and the wildfires in Greece last summer were well documented. You've also got drought, and that leading to a lot of climate-enforced migration. But then you've also got floods, such as the ones saw in Pakistan earlier this year, and the damage that causes to villages around the world. And also, I think there's sometimes an idea that this is something that happens elsewhere in the world. But I think it is clear that there are some impacts closer to home. And it'd be interesting to hear from attendees, have you seen or heard of any impacts of climate change in Havering recently or over the last couple of years or across wider London? Peter?
The fires at Wennington.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other impacts that come to mind? Flooding in Rainham. Yeah, agreed. Thanks, Karen.
Not really any particular events, but just the general heat increasing every year. And it said it on the last slide, but the heat waves recently have been quite substantial.
Yes, agreed. No, thank you all. I think those interestingly cover the kind of broad range of climate impacts. We've got heat waves, heat stress, and the issues that causes in terms of fires. Then you've also got floods, and the examples that we pulled out are exactly the ones that you mentioned, the major flooding in 2021, and then the heat warning and fires in Wellington in 2022. Just got a quick video which talks about the importance of acting now. Let me know if you can hear this.
I have to wait. I'm not stuck like 10 minutes.
Every aspect of our lives will be touched by climate change. Climate is not something that's happening elsewhere. It's not happening to other people, even if it may be hitting other populations more intensely than it's hitting the one that you're in. It will touch every life and transform every aspect of that life, down to the decisions we make with our children and family, where we live, what kinds of jobs are available, how much economic growth we can come to expect. It's a totalizing, all-encompassing system, and everything we do over the next century will be conducted in the theater of climate change. We had been taught to expect that climate change was very, very slow, that it was something that would be unfolding on a timescale of decades. And so we could imagine, while it might be a problem for our grandchildren and their grandchildren, that we had a lot of time to address the issue. We had a lot of time to grow our way out of the issue and invent technological solutions to the problem. In fact, more than half of all of the fossil fuel emissions that we've put into the atmosphere in all of human history have been produced in the last 25 years, which means that we've now done more damage to the climate since Al Gore wrote his first book on global warming, since the UN established the IPCC, and in all the millennia before. This is not an old phenomenon. We're not dealing with the legacy of the Industrial Revolution. We're dealing with the damage that we're doing every day in real time. And we're seeing that damage on our TV screens finally in the last few years with coverage of extreme weather, natural disasters. But people haven't really begun to appreciate just how much more will be coming, how much faster the problems will be accelerating, and how little time we have to deal with the problem. They say that if we end up where we'll be at the end of the century without changing course, our grain yields could be half as bountiful as they are today, which means we could have 50% more people on the planet and half as much grain to give them. On economics, if we, again, stay on the course that we're on by the end of the century, we'll have seen $600 trillion in damages from climate change, which is more than double all the wealth that exists in the world today. There's horrifying research on the relationship between climate and conflict, so that every half degree of warming, you see between 10 and 20% increase in conflict. We're now at about 1 or 1.1 degrees of Celsius warming above the pre-industrial average. The UN projects that on the course we're on now, by the end of the century, at a little north of 4 degrees of warming. And at that point, there'll be parts of the world that could be hit with 6 climate-driven natural disasters at once. The UN believes we could be dealing with as many as 1 billion climate refugees. We've already left the world that we all grew up on. The planet is now hotter than at any point in all of human history. We are responsible for this climate that we are walking into, and just how bad it gets will always be up to us. Every tick upward of temperature makes all of these impacts, from agricultural yields to conflict to public health issues to sea level rise, makes each of those worse. And how far along the path to, say, 4.3 degrees we get will be determined by what we do. The future of humanity is literally in our hands, and by that I mean not just the people who will live on the planet over the next century, but literally the people who are taking action now, today. We are writing the climate future of the next decade now, and we are facing the possibility, although it's vanishingly thin, of human extinction at our own hands. And if we avoid that, which I hope and trust that we will, it will be entirely because we have made affirmative choices to avoid it. That story in addition to being horrifying, distressing, and dispiriting, is also, I think, again, empowering in that it reminds us that we are completely in control of our own fate. And so as horrible as it sounds to contemplate these futures, they are only at the moment hypothetical, and whether we get them and make them real will be our doing. If we get there, we will have been responsible for that suffering, and if we avoid them, we will be responsible for that alternative outcome.
So I hope you enjoyed that. I think it was put very eloquently, much more so than we can do in terms of what the impacts of climate change might look like on a global scale. Something that video didn't touch upon, but I think is really important because we hear about these terms quite a lot in the media, and it's useful to know what they actually mean, is why do we talk about 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees? These numbers are kind of bandied around quite a lot. The reason that these are important is that the IPCC, that Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they've stated that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees instead of 2 degrees could result in significantly less extreme climate impacts and reduce the pressure on our resilience. For example, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees instead of 2 degrees could result in about 420 million fewer people being frequently exposed to extreme heat waves. So the 1.5 degrees is a goal that many organisations have set when they're setting a decarbonisation strategy, which we're going to talk about in that next session. You set it to be in line with 1.5 degrees or limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, or to try to keep global warming within or well below 2 degrees. Although it is also not to be doom and gloom, important to remember the 1.5 degrees temperature rise is still not an attractive target, but it's kind of the least worst case outcome that we can be aiming for at the moment. Just dive into that a little bit more in terms of the significant differences between present day and global warming of 1.5 degrees, and then between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. As you can see there, 1.5 degrees leads to extreme temperatures, increased frequency and intensity of heavy precipitation, but also simultaneously increasing the intensity and frequency of the occurrence of droughts. Whereas a 2 degrees warming, additional sea level rise, even greater loss of coral reefs, and several hundred million more people exposed to climate-related risks and poverty. So aiming for that 1.5 degrees, though still not ideal, is very much what most organisations are trying to achieve when they're setting their decarbonisation strategies. Another thing that might have cropped up quite a lot on your news stories is about the COP. So these are annual events. They stand for the Conference of the Parties, and that's when delegates from all around the world, from all countries, get together and discuss what pledges they'll be making to reduce their emissions. The latest one was COP28, held in Dubai, I think, and the implementation of the pledges made at COP28 only reduce emissions needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, but only reaches a third of that. So the 1.5 degrees target, that was set at the Paris Agreement in 2015, but the current pledges from all of these national governments only reach a third of the reduction of emissions that we need. You can see there again that 1.5 degrees to achieve keeping global warming within 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, that requires CO2 emissions to decline by 45% from 2010 levels to 2030, and then reach net zero by 2050. To keep global warming within 2 degrees, that means that emissions have to decline by 25% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2070. And you'll know that the UK government set the net zero target of 2050. They're one of several governments to have done so, but not all global governments have net zero targets. Hence, that the pledges made at COP28 do not reach the required level of emissions reduction. Thinking a bit more locally again, the impacts of climate change are not just something that will be seen around the world. We are expecting climate change impacts to occur over London, and one of the most prevalent will be in terms of flooding. Many climate change impacts facing the world also impact London, and that could be heat waves, flooding, and drought, and of course the associated impact of those things. One of the biggest threats to London is surface water flooding, due to the fact that large areas of land are impermeable. And the frequency of torrential rains in London in autumn and winter have increased in the past 2 decades and expected to double by 2070. And this map here shows the land that is projected to be below the annual flood level in 2030, keeping to our current trajectory of global warming. And that is a kind of whistle-stop tour of climate change drivers and impacts. I would very much state that it is not all doom and gloom. A huge number of people and governments and policymakers are focusing on climate change and what can be done about it, setting decarbonisations and setting decarbonisation strategies and plans. And the next session is going to focus on how your business could join them. Are there any questions on any of the things that we discussed today? Great. Maybe you guys can deliver the training tomorrow. So in terms of just a quick summary of what we covered, by now you should know what the drivers of climate change are and what the impacts of climate change are and why it is so important for us to tackle climate change. As I mentioned, this is one of 2 sessions. This is the online one. We've got an in-person one in a few weeks' time. And that is very much focusing on, okay, we've learned about all of the impacts of climate change. What can my business or my organisation do about that? So it's focusing on how to create a bespoke and actionable carbon action plan. There's a big focus on how to monitor that progress through time, setting a baseline, understanding your current impacts, and then looking forward, and also engaging the relevant stakeholders in that. And here we've got a snazzy link to sign up to those sessions if you haven't already. And we can put a link in the chat as well that you can follow to the Eventbrite link to sign up for that in-person session in the week commencing the 23rd of September. And apart from that, I will just say thank you very much for attending and for contributing. I hope that it was useful and interesting.